Welcome back, listeners, to another soft-spoken journey through history's shadows. Whether your night is just beginning or winding down, I'm glad you're here. Let me know in the comments if you're listening from a quiet, distant place or a bustling city. If these calming explorations bring you peace, please consider subscribing. Many more voices from the past are waiting to be heard. Most people don't grasp the true terror of Viking warriors. Hollywood, TV, and even most history books barely scratch the surface of their sheer brutality. We're talking about warriors who didn't just fight. They transformed into something almost inhuman on the battlefield. These were individuals who believed dying in combat was the ultimate honor, who'd literally bite their shields in a frenzy, and who struck such fear that entire kingdoms paid massive tributes just to avoid facing them. In this video, I'm unveiling the most spine-chilling Viking warriors who ever lived. Their names alone could empty villages. These warriors developed fighting techniques so brutal and effective they dominated Europe for over 3 centuries. I'll walk you through their most terrifying battles, their most savage tactics, and the psychological warfare that made them absolutely unstoppable. But first, let me give you some context on just how genuinely frightening these warriors were. What I'm about to share goes far beyond anything in popular culture. My name is your name, and I've spent the last 2 years diving deep into historical records, archaeological evidence, and first-hand accounts from the Viking Age. I've studied ancient sagas, analyzed battlefield excavations, and consulted with leading historians to bring you the most accurate and bone-chilling account of these legendary warriors. What you're about to discover isn't just history. It's a journey into the minds of people who lived for war, embraced death, and forged a legacy of terror that still echoes through time. Before we dive into individual warriors, it's crucial to understand a core aspect of Viking culture that made these fighters so utterly terrifying. This wasn't just about being tough or skilled with weapons. Vikings had a fundamentally different relationship with death and violence than any other culture in history. They believed warriors who died gloriously in battle would be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight for eternity alongside the gods. This wasn't just a religious belief. It was a driving obsession that radically altered their approach to combat. Imagine facing an enemy who genuinely desires to die fighting you, not suicidally, but because they believe dying in battle is the most glorious fate imaginable. This psychological element made Viking warriors incredibly unpredictable and impossibly dangerous. They'd take risks no rational fighter would, charging into impossible odds with genuine excitement, and fighting through wounds that would fell normal men, driven by the belief that every moment of pain brought them closer to eternal glory. But it gets even more terrifying. Vikings didn't just accept death in battle. They actively sought out the most dangerous and challenging fights. They deliberately pursue the strongest enemies, the most fortified positions, the most hopeless situations, believing overcoming these challenges would earn them greater honor in the afterlife. This forged warriors who were not just fearless, but actively pursued the most terrifying combat scenarios imaginable. The training these warriors underwent was equally brutal. From childhood, Viking boys were taught not just to fight, but to embrace pain and violence as natural parts of life. They'd practice with real weapons, not wooden swords, engaging in combat exercises that regularly resulted in serious injuries. They were taught to ignore pain, to fight through wounds, and to see blood and violence as beautiful expressions of strength and courage. Their weapons were designed specifically to maximize terror and devastation. The Viking battle axe wasn't just for cutting enemies. It was a psychological weapon designed to intimidate and demoralize. The sight of a massive Viking warrior swinging a double-headed axe with enough force to cleave through armor, shields, and bone in a single strike was enough to break the morale of entire enemy formations. The sound alone, that terrible whistling through the air, followed by the wet thud of impact, would haunt the nightmares of anyone who survived it. Their shields weren't just defensive tools either. Vikings used their shields as weapons, slamming them into enemies' faces, hooking them behind enemy shields to create openings, and forming shield walls that moved like unstoppable waves of destruction across battlefields. The coordination required to maintain these shield walls while advancing over rough terrain and through enemy fire was incredible, but Vikings trained for this from childhood. The psychological warfare tactics they employed were equally sophisticated and terrifying. Vikings understood that fear was often more powerful than any weapon. They deliberately cultivated reputations for extreme brutality, not just for enjoyment, but because they knew terrified enemies were defeated before the fighting even began. They'd leave survivors from raids specifically to spread stories of their savagery, display the heads of defeated enemies as warnings and time. Their attacks to maximize psychological impact, often striking during religious festivals or at night when defenders were least prepared. The berserkers represent perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Viking warrior culture. These weren't just tough fighters. They were men who had trained themselves to enter altered states of consciousness during combat. They'd work themselves into trances through meditation, ritual, and possibly psychoactive substances. In these states, they became completely immune to pain, fear, and rational thought. They'd fight with supernatural strength and endurance, often continuing to battle even after receiving wounds that should have been fatal. Witnesses described berserkers literally transforming during combat. Their eyes would roll back, foam would pour from their mouths, and they'd make sounds that didn't seem human. They'd bite their shields, tear at their own skin, and attack with such fury they seemed more like wild animals than men. Enemy soldiers would sometimes throw down their weapons and flee rather than face a berserker, because fighting them felt like battling demons, not humans. The training to become a berserker was incredibly dangerous, and not everyone survived it. Candidates underwent extreme physical and psychological conditioning, designed to break down their normal human responses to pain and fear. They practiced fighting while injured, learned to ignore their body's distress signals, and developed the ability to enter trance states at will. Only those who could completely suppress their survival instincts and fight with total abandon could become true berserkers. But the individual warriors we're about to explore took even these extreme practices to new levels. These weren't just skilled fighters or even typical berserkers. These were individuals who became legends specifically because they transcended normal human limitations in combat. They developed techniques, achieved victories, and inspired such terror that their names became synonymous with death itself. The first warrior we need to discuss embodies everything that made Viking combat so absolutely terrifying. This individual didn't just fight battles. He redefined what it meant to be a warrior. His methods were so brutal, his victories so complete, and his presence on the battlefield so overwhelming that enemy armies would sometimes surrender rather than face him. His story begins in the frozen fjords of Norway, where he was born into a culture that valued martial prowess above all else. From childhood, this warrior showed signs of the savage potential that would later make him legendary. While other children played, he practiced with real weapons. While others learned to read and write, he studied the art of war. By adolescence, he had already killed his first enemy in combat, and the experience awakened something in him that would never be satisfied with ordinary life. His physical presence alone was enough to intimidate most opponents. Standing well over 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, he possessed the kind of muscular development that came from a lifetime of wielding heavy weapons and wearing armor. His hands were massive, scarred from countless battles, and strong enough to crush a man's skull with his bare fingers. His face bore the marks of numerous fights, but his eyes were what truly terrified people. They held a cold, calculating intelligence, combined with an absolute absence of mercy or compassion. The weapons he preferred were specifically chosen to maximize the terror he could inspire. His primary weapon was a massive two-handed axe that most men couldn't even lift, let alone swing. Effectively in combat, the blade was nearly 2 feet across, sharp enough to cut through armor like cloth, and heavy enough to shatter shields and bones with equal ease. He had trained with this weapon for so many years that it seemed to become an extension of his own body, moving with impossible speed and precision despite its enormous size. But what truly set this warrior apart wasn't just his physical capabilities or his weapons. It was his tactical brilliance combined with an absolute ruthlessness that made him unstoppable in combat. He understood that warfare wasn't just about individual strength. It was about breaking the enemy's will to fight. He'd study his opponents before battle, learning their weaknesses, their fears, and their breaking points. Then he'd exploit these vulnerabilities with surgical precision. His first major victory came during a raid on a heavily fortified monastery. The monks had hired mercenaries to defend their treasure, confident that their stone walls and trained soldiers would protect them. They were wrong. This warrior spent 3 days observing the defenses, noting patrol patterns, identifying weak points, and planning his attack. When he finally struck, it wasn't with overwhelming force, but with perfect timing and positioning. He infiltrated the monastery at night, moving through the shadows like a ghost, despite his massive size. He eliminated the sentries one by one, using techniques that were silent but unmistakably brutal. Each guard was found the next morning, positioned in a way that sent a clear message to the remaining defenders. By dawn, the mercenaries were already demoralized, jumping at shadows and seeing threats in every corner. When the final assault came, it was over in minutes. The warrior led his men through the breach he had created, moving with such speed and violence that the defenders had no time to organize a proper response. But it wasn't just the speed of the attack that broke them. It was the sheer brutality of his personal combat style. He didn't just defeat enemies. He destroyed them so completely that other defenders would freeze in terror at the sight. The aftermath of this battle established the pattern that would define his entire career. He didn't just take the treasure and leave. He made sure that word of his victory spread exactly as he wanted. Some defenders were allowed to escape, but only after witnessing scenes of violence so extreme that they would never forget them. The stories they told would reach other potential targets, preparing them to surrender rather than face this terrifying warrior in combat. The psychological warfare was just as important as his physical prowess. He understood that reputation was a weapon that could win battles before they even began. Each victory was carefully orchestrated not just to achieve immediate objectives, but to enhance his growing legend. He would leave specific signs at each battle site, symbols that would identify him as the perpetrator and remind everyone of his capabilities. The techniques he developed for psychological intimidation were incredibly sophisticated. He'd arrive at target locations days before his planned attack, making his presence known but not revealing his intentions. Defenders would see him observing their fortifications, studying their routines, and preparing for something terrible. The anticipation itself became a form of torture, wearing down their resolve before the fighting even began. His reputation grew with each conquest, but it was his encounter with the legendary warrior king Hakon the Red that truly cemented his place among the most terrifying fighters in Viking history. Hakon controlled a massive fortress overlooking the North Sea, a stronghold that had never fallen to enemy attack. The fortress was built into the living rock of a cliff face, accessible only by a narrow path that could be defended by a handful of men against an entire army. But this warrior didn't see an impregnable fortress. He saw an opportunity to demonstrate that no defense could withstand his particular brand of warfare. The siege that followed would become the stuff of legend, not because of its scale, but because of the psychological horror he unleashed upon the defenders. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the narrow path, he began what can only be described as a campaign of terror. Every night, defenders would find evidence that he had been inside their supposedly secure fortress. A guard would be found dead at his post, killed so quietly that men sleeping nearby heard nothing. Weapons would disappear from armories, only to be found later arranged in patterns that spelled out threats in the old runic alphabet. Food supplies would be poisoned, not enough to kill, but enough to cause agonizing sickness that would last for days. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Defenders stopped sleeping, afraid they would be the next victim. They began to turn on each other, suspecting enemy infiltration. Some tried to flee, but their bodies were found at the base of the cliff, arranged in positions that made it clear they hadn't simply fallen. The message was unmistakable. There was no escape from this warrior's reach. After 2 weeks of this psychological torture, Hakon the Red finally agreed to single combat. It was the only way to end the nightmare that had consumed his fortress. The fight took place on a narrow ledge overlooking the sea, with barely enough room for 2 men to swing their weapons. Witnesses described it as the most brutal single combat they had ever seen, not because of its length, but because of the sheer violence that erupted in those few minutes. The warrior's opponent was no ordinary fighter. Hakon was a veteran of dozens of battles, a man who had earned his reputation through years of successful warfare. He stood nearly as tall as his challenger, carried weapons of equal quality, and possessed the kind of experience that should have made him a formidable opponent. But experience couldn't prepare him for what he faced that day. The fight began with the traditional exchange of insults and boasts, but something in the warrior's voice made it clear that this wasn't just another battle. His words carried a weight of absolute certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided by the gods themselves. When he spoke of what he would do to his opponent, witnesses felt their blood run cold. These weren't empty threats or battle boasts. They were promises delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had never failed to keep his word. When the combat finally began, it was over almost before it started. The warrior's first strike was so fast and powerful that Hakon barely had time to raise his shield. The massive axe smashed through the wooden barrier and continued its arc, opening a wound across his opponent's chest that would have dropped most men instantly. But Hakon was no ordinary warrior, and he managed to stay on his feet long enough to launch a counterattack. The counterattack never landed. The warrior flowed around his opponent's strike like water, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone of his size. His return strike caught Hakon in the side, the axe blade penetrating so deeply that witnesses heard ribs cracking from 50 feet away. Blood sprayed across the rocky ledge. But the warrior wasn't finished. He grabbed his wounded opponent by the throat and lifted him off the ground, holding him suspended over the cliff edge. What happened next became the most whispered moment in Viking warfare. Rather than simply throwing his defeated enemy to his death, the warrior began to speak. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as he described in vivid detail exactly what would happen to every defender in the fortress. He painted pictures of violence so extreme that grown men turned away in horror. Then, still holding Hakon by the throat, he made his final offer. Surrender now, and the deaths would be quick. Continue to resist, and he would ensure that every person in the fortress experienced the kind of prolonged agony that would make them beg for the mercy of death. Hakon, blood running down his chest and his feet dangling over empty air, managed to gasp out his surrender. The warrior released him, letting him fall to the ledge rather than into the abyss below. The fortress surrendered without another blow being struck. The defenders had watched their legendary leader reduced to a broken, bleeding man in a matter of minutes. They had heard the promises of what would happen if they continued to resist. Most importantly, they had seen the complete absence of mercy or compassion in their enemies' eyes. This wasn't a man who could be reasoned with or appealed to. This was a force of nature that would destroy everything in its path unless it was given what it wanted. The treasure taken from that fortress was enormous, but the warrior's real prize was the enhancement of his reputation. Word of Hakon's defeat spread across the Viking world like wildfire. The story grew with each telling, but the essential details remained constant. A legendary warrior king had been broken, like a twig by a fighter whose name was beginning to be spoken only in whispers. But even this victory was just preparation for the campaign that would make him truly legendary. The warrior had set his sights on the most ambitious target any Viking had ever attempted, the conquest of an entire kingdom. Not just a raid or a single battle, but the complete subjugation of a land and its people. The kingdom he chose was ruled by a king who had spent years preparing for Viking attacks, who had built a network of fortresses and assembled an army specifically designed to counter Viking tactics. King Uldric of Mercia was no fool. He had studied Viking warfare for decades, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, developing countermeasures for their most effective tactics. His kingdom was protected by a series of fortified towns, connected by excellent roads, allowing for a rapid deployment of troops to any threatened area. His army was well-trained, well-equipped, and commanded by experienced officers who understood Viking psychology and methods. Most importantly, Uldric had negotiated alliances with neighboring kingdoms. Any Viking force large enough to threaten Mercia would face not just his own army, but combined forces from multiple kingdoms. The mathematics seemed impossible. No Viking chieftain had ever attempted to conquer a kingdom with such extensive defenses and political connections. But mathematics had never stopped this warrior before. He spent an entire winter studying intelligence reports about Mercia, learning everything he could about its defenses, its politics, and its king. He identified the kingdom's strengths, but more importantly, he found its weaknesses. Every defensive system had flaws, and every alliance had fault lines that could be exploited by someone with sufficient ruthlessness and intelligence. His campaign began not with a massive invasion, but with a series of seemingly random attacks on outlying settlements. These weren't typical Viking raids focused on wealth and slaves. These were carefully planned strikes designed to test Mercia as response capabilities and gather intelligence about its military organization. Each attack revealed more about how the kingdom's defenses operated, how quickly troops could be deployed, and how effectively the alliance system functioned under pressure. The pattern of these attacks was so subtle that it took months for Uldric to realize what was happening. By the time he understood that he was facing not random raids, but a coordinated intelligence-gathering campaign, it was too late. The warrior had already identified the perfect target for his real assault, a fortress that controlled the main river crossing into the kingdom's heartland. The fortress of Ravenscroft was considered impregnable. Built on a high hill overlooking the river, it commanded views for miles in every direction. Its walls were thick stone, its garrison was elite troops, and its position made it impossible to approach without being seen. Taking Ravenscroft would require a frontal assault up an open hillside against prepared defenses, the kind of attack that had failed countless times throughout military history, but the warrior had no intention of making a frontal assault. His plan was far more sophisticated and infinitely more terrifying. He would take Ravenscroft not through superior numbers or better weapons, but through the systematic destruction of everything the defenders held dear. He would turn their greatest strength, their secure position, into their greatest weakness. The siege began in the dead of winter, when conventional military wisdom said that campaigning was impossible. The warriors' forces appeared around Ravenscroft like ghosts, moving through the snow and ice with an efficiency that seemed supernatural. They didn't build siege engines or assault towers. Instead, they began a campaign of psychological warfare that would redefine the very concept of siege warfare. Every morning, the defenders would wake to find new evidence of their enemy's presence. Livestock in nearby farms would be found slaughtered, not for food, but arranged in patterns that spelled out messages in the old runic script. Wells would be poisoned, not enough to kill, but enough to cause terrible sickness. Most horrifying of all, people from surrounding villages would simply disappear, leaving behind only bloodstains and signs of struggle. The warrior understood that isolation was the fortress's greatest vulnerability. The defenders were cut off from the outside world, dependent on their own supplies and morale. By systematically destroying everything around them, he created a psychological prison that was more effective than any physical siege. The defenders could see smoke rising from burning farmhouses, could hear the distant screams of people being tortured, could smell the stench of death that grew stronger with each passing day. But it was the sounds that truly broke their spirits. Every night, the darkness around Ravenscroft would fill with noises that seemed to come from the depths of nightmare itself. Howling that might have been wolves, or might have been something far worse. Rhythmic pounding that could have been drums, or could have been the sound of bodies being beaten against stone. Most terrifying of all, the sound of laughter high and mad and utterly without mercy echoing off the fortress walls in the deepest hours of night. Sleep became impossible within the fortress walls. The defenders would huddle together in the great hall, weapons clutched in trembling hands, jumping at every shadow that flickered in the torchlight. Some began to crack under the pressure, speaking in whispers about surrender, about anything that might end the psychological torment that had consumed their lives. But their commander, a grizzled veteran named Sir Godwin, knew that surrender to this particular enemy would bring horrors far worse than death. The warrior's reputation had preceded him to Ravenscroft. Stories of his previous conquests had filtered through the kingdom, each tale more terrifying than the last. The defenders knew that this was just another Viking raid that could be waited out behind strong walls. This was something far more sinister, a calculated campaign of terror, designed to break their minds before their bodies ever faced a weapon. What made the psychological assault even more effective was its unpredictability. Sometimes the attacks would come in waves, with multiple incidents occurring in a single night. Other times, days would pass in perfect silence, allowing the defenders to begin hoping that their tormentor had moved on, only to wake to fresh horrors that proved he was still watching, still waiting, still planning their destruction. The warrior's tactical brilliance became apparent as the siege progressed. He wasn't just terrorizing the defenders for the sake of cruelty, though he certainly seemed to enjoy their suffering. Every action was calculated to achieve specific psychological effects. The seemingly random attacks on surrounding settlements weren't random at all. They were designed to cut off the fortress's supply lines, eliminate potential reinforcements, and create a growing circle of desolation that would isolate the defenders completely. More importantly, the attacks were timed to coincide with the defenders' religious observances. The warrior had studied their faith, learned their holy days, and planned his most horrific displays to occur during their most sacred moments. When the defenders gathered for morning prayers, they would find blasphemous symbols carved into the chapel walls. When they observed their weekly day of rest, they would discover the mutilated bodies of local priests arranged in mockery of their religious ceremonies. This wasn't just warfare. It was a systematic assault on everything the defenders believed in. The warrior understood that breaking a man's faith was more effective than breaking his body. A wounded soldier could still fight, but a man who had lost his connection to his God would lose the will to resist. The psychological pressure built day by day, week by week, until the very foundations of the defender's identity began to crumble. The fortress's food supplies became another weapon in the warrior's arsenal. Rather than simply cutting off supply lines, he contaminated them with substances that caused hallucinations and paranoia. Defenders would see enemies in shadows, hear voices that weren't there, and turn on each other in fits of madness. The warrior had learned these techniques from shamans and wise women during his Travel's dark knowledge that transformed ordinary siege warfare into something approaching supernatural horror. As winter deepened, the isolation became complete. No messenger had reached the fortress in weeks. No relief force had appeared on the horizon. The defenders began to realize that they had been abandoned by their king, left to face this nightmare alone. The warrior had anticipated this psychological breaking point, and he chose this moment to make his first direct contact with the defenders. The message came in the form of a severed head thrown over the fortress walls, but this wasn't just any head. It belonged to Sir Marcus, the king's own messenger, who had been sent to coordinate the fortress's defense. Tied to the head was a parchment written in the messenger's own blood, containing an offer that made the defenders' blood run cold. The warrior offered them a choice. They could continue their hopeless resistance and face the kind of death that would make their families weep for generations, or they could open their gates and accept his terms. The terms were simple. Half the garrison would be allowed to live, chosen by lot, while the other half would die in ways that would serve as examples to future enemies. The surviving defenders would be given the honor of spreading word of what they had witnessed, carrying the warrior's reputation to every corner of the kingdom. But there was a time limit. The defenders had until the next full moon to decide. If they had not surrendered by then, the warrior would take the fortress by force, and no mercy would be shown to anyone within its walls. The message was signed with a symbol that had become synonymous with death itself. A raven perched on a skull, wings spread wide in mockery of divine protection. The debate that followed nearly tore the garrison apart. Some argued for surrender, pointing out that half their number surviving was better than all of them dying. Others insisted that their honor demanded they fight to the death regardless of the odds. Sir Godwin found himself caught between his duty to his king and his responsibility to his men. The warrior's offer was designed to create exactly this kind of division, turning the defenders against each other when unity was their only hope. As the full moon approached, the psychological pressure reached unbearable levels. The nightly sounds of torture grew louder and more frequent. The stench of death became so overwhelming that some defenders vomited whenever they tried to eat. Most terrifying of all, the warrior himself began to appear on the hilltop surrounding the fortress, a massive silhouette against the sky that seemed to watch their every movement. His presence was unmistakable even at a distance. The way he moved, the way he held himself, the very aura of menace that surrounded him marked him as something beyond ordinary human experience. Defenders who caught sight of him would find themselves paralyzed with fear, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at them to hide. Some claimed they could feel his eyes upon them, even when he was nowhere to be seen, a sensation that followed them into their dreams and haunted their waking hours. The warrior's physical appearance had become the stuff of legend throughout the kingdom. Those who had seen him and survived described a figure that seemed carved from nightmare itself. His armor was black as midnight, decorated with the bones of his enemies and marked with runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. His helmet was fashioned from the skull of some great beast, its empty eye sockets seeming to follow anyone who dared to look upon it. But it was his weapons that truly marked him as something beyond mortal comprehension. The massive axe he carried had been forged from metal that seemed to drink in light, its blade etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The weapon had a name whispered in terror throughout the Viking world: Skull Splitter, the Bane of Kings, the Harvester of Souls. It was said that the axe thirsted for blood, that it would sing with joy when it tasted the life of a worthy opponent. His secondary weapons were equally terrifying, a collection of throwing axes, each one perfectly balanced and sharp enough to split mail at 50 paces. A seax, the traditional Viking fighting knife, but enlarged to the size of a short sword and inscribed with curses in the old tongue. Most disturbing of all, a whip made from the braided hair of his victims. weighted with iron beads that could crush bone or strip flesh from a man's body with a single strike. The night before the full moon deadline, the warrior made his final psychological assault on the fortress. He appeared at the main gate, alone and apparently unarmed, calling out for Sir Godwin to meet him in single combat. The terms were simple. If Godwin could defeat him, the siege would end and the fortress would be spared. If the warrior won, the entire garrison would surrender immediately and accept whatever fate he chose for them. It was an impossible choice. Sir Godwin was a skilled fighter, but he was also a practical man who understood the odds he faced. No warrior had ever defeated this monster in single combat. The stories of his victories were a legend throughout the known world, but refusing the challenge would mark him as a coward, destroying his authority over the garrison and ensuring that they would surrender anyway. The combat took place by torchlight on the open ground before the fortress gates. The entire garrison watched from the walls, their faces pale with fear and anticipation. The warrior had indeed come apparently unarmed, but as he stepped into the circle of light, he began to change. His movements became more fluid, more predatory. His breathing deepened into the rhythmic pattern that marked the beginning of a berserker's trance. Sir Godwin had prepared for this moment his entire life. He wore his finest armor, carried his best weapons, and had spent hours in prayer asking for divine protection. But as he looked into his opponent's eyes, he realized that all his preparation might not be enough. The warrior's gaze held depths of violence and madness that no normal human could comprehend. This wasn't just a skilled fighter. This was something that had transcended ordinary humanity through years of constant warfare and bloodshed. The fight began with traditional formalities, but these quickly gave way to something far more primitive and terrifying. The warrior's transformation into berserker fury was unlike anything the watching defenders had ever seen. His movements became inhumanly fast and powerful. His attacks delivered with such force that they seemed to bend the very air around them. Most disturbing of all, he began to laugh, a sound that carried no trace of human warmth or sanity. Sir Godwin fought with the skill and courage of a lifetime warrior, but he was facing something beyond mortal comprehension. The warrior's bare hands proved to be weapons more deadly than any sword. His fingers, strengthened by years of gripping heavy weapons, could crush steel rings or snap bones with casual ease. His speed was supernatural, allowing him to flow around his opponent's attacks like smoke and strike from impossible angles. The end came with shocking suddenness. One moment, Sir Godwin was pressing what seemed like a successful attack, his sword aimed at his opponent's heart. The next, he was lifted off the ground by a hand around his throat, his weapon fallen from nerveless fingers. The warrior held him suspended for a long moment, letting the watching defenders see their commander. This helplessness before speaking in a voice that carried clearly to every man on the walls. The words he spoke were in the old tongue, but their meaning was unmistakable. He was claiming Sir Godwin's life as an offering to the gods of war, a sacrifice that would ensure victory in the battles to come. The execution that followed was swift but utterly brutal, designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance. When it was over, the warrior stood over his victim's body and called out his final ultimatum to the fortress. The gates would open at dawn, or he would take the fortress by storm. If he was forced to attack, no defender would survive to see another sunset. Their deaths would be slow and agonizing, their bodies displayed as warnings to any who might think to oppose him in the future. The choice was theirs, but they had until the first light of dawn to decide. The debate that followed was brief and bitter. With their commander dead and their morale shattered, the defenders had no real choice. As the first rays of sunlight touched the fortress walls, the gates swung open and the garrison filed out to surrender. But the warrior's mercy proved to be as terrible as his wrath. True to his word, he spared half the garrison, chosen by lot as he had promised. The other half faced deaths that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The fall of Ravenscroft sent shockwaves throughout the kingdom. King Aldrich's supposedly impregnable fortress had fallen without a proper siege. Its legendary commander defeated in single combat by a warrior who seemed more demon than man. The psychological impact was exactly what the warrior had intended. Other fortresses began to surrender at the mere approach of his forces, their defenders unwilling to face the horrors that had consumed Ravenscroft. But the warrior's campaign was far from over. The conquest of Ravenscroft was just the beginning of a systematic campaign that would bring an entire kingdom to its knees. His next target was the city of Uldricburg, the kingdom's capital and the seat of King Uldric's power. If Ravenscroft had been considered impregnable, Uldricburg was thought to be absolutely unconquerable. The city was protected by massive walls that had never been breached, defended by the kingdom's elite troops, and supplied by river barges that could maintain the garrison indefinitely. More importantly, it was where King Uldric had concentrated his remaining forces, turning the capital into a fortress that could theoretically hold out against any conceivable attack. But the warrior had already proven that conventional thinking meant nothing when faced with his particular brand of warfare. He had studied the city's defenses, identified its weaknesses, and developed a plan that would turn its greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. The siege of Uldricburg would become the defining moment of his career, the battle that would cement his reputation as the most terrifying warrior in Viking history. The approach he chose was unlike anything attempted in medieval warfare. Rather than surrounding the city and starving it into submission, he would strike at its heart through methods that would make the defenders wish they had never been born. The psychological warfare that had proven so effective at Ravenscroft would be refined and intensified until it became a weapon more devastating than any siege engine. His first move was to capture the river barges that supplied the city, but rather than simply sinking them or stealing their cargo, he turned them into floating exhibitions of horror. The crews were tortured in ways that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, their agonized screams echoing across the water to reach the city walls. The barges themselves were set adrift, their cargo holds filled with the mutilated bodies of their crews, serving as floating messengers that announced the warrior's arrival. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The city's defenders watched in horror as their supply lines were not just cut, but transformed into instruments of terror. The sight of those drifting barges with their grisly cargo visible to anyone who looked upon the river sent a clear message about what fate awaited anyone who opposed this terrifying enemy. But the warrior was just getting started. His reputation had grown with each victory, each display of tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. The stories told about him had taken on an almost mythical quality, describing feats that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Some claimed he could see in complete darkness, that he could move without making a sound, that he could kill with a touch or a glance. Whether these stories were true or not, they had become weapons in their own right. The mere mention of his name was enough to send seasoned warriors into fits of panic. Mothers would use his name to frighten disobedient children. Priests would invoke his image when describing the torments of the damned. He had become more than just a warrior. He had become the living embodiment of every nightmare that haunted the dreams of civilized men. The siege of Uldricburg would prove to be the ultimate test of his abilities. King Uldric had spent years preparing for this moment, gathering allies, training troops, and fortifying his capital against any conceivable attack. The coming battle would determine not just the fate of a single kingdom, but the future of an entire region. If the warrior could conquer Uldricburg, no fortress in the known world would be safe from his particular brand of terror. The preparations for the siege revealed the true scope of the warrior's tactical genius. While King Uldric marshaled his defenses behind the massive walls of Uldricburg, The warrior was implementing a strategy so complex and far-reaching that it would take months for its full horror to become apparent. He had learned from his previous campaigns that the greatest victories came not from superior numbers or better weapons, but from understanding the deepest fears and weaknesses of his enemies. The warrior's first move was to establish a network of terror that extended far beyond the city walls. He dispatched small groups of his most trusted fighters to every village and town within 100 miles of Ulrichburg. But these weren't typical raiding parties. Each group had specific instructions designed to create maximum psychological impact with minimal actual force. They would arrive at their targets like ghosts in the night, leaving behind carefully orchestrated scenes of horror that would send survivors fleeing toward the capital with tales of supernatural dread. The genius of this approach became clear as refugees began flooding into Ulrichburg. These weren't just displaced villagers seeking protection. They were carriers of a psychological plague that would infect the entire city. Each refugee brought stories of impossible horrors, of attackers who seemed to materialize from shadows and disappear like smoke. The stories grew with each telling, becoming more fantastical and terrifying until the warrior's reputation had grown to mythical proportions. But the refugee crisis served another purpose that was even more devastating. The sudden influx of thousands of displaced people strained the city's resources to the breaking point. Food supplies that had been calculated to last months were consumed in weeks. Water systems designed for the normal population couldn't handle the massive increase in demand. Most critically, the sewage and waste management systems began to fail, creating conditions that would soon breed disease and despair. The warrior had anticipated this crisis and prepared for it with the same meticulous planning that characterized all his campaigns. His forces began intercepting supply convoys bound for the city, but rather than simply destroying them, they contaminated the supplies with substances that would cause sickness and hallucinations. Grain shipments were treated with ergot fungus that would cause violent fits and paranoid delusions. Water barrels were dosed with compounds that would induce diarrhea and vomiting. Even clothing and blankets were treated with irritants that would cause painful rashes and open sores. The contaminated supplies were then allowed to reach the city, often accompanied by forged documents that made them appear to come from trusted allies. The defenders, desperate for any relief from their supply crisis, accepted these gifts without question. Within days, the effects began to manifest throughout the population. People began seeing enemies in shadows, hearing voices that weren't there, and turning on each other in fits of paranoid rage. The warrior's psychological warfare reached new levels of sophistication. As the siege progressed, he had studied the religious beliefs of his enemies, learning their prayers, their holy days, and their most sacred rituals. This knowledge became another weapon in his arsenal, allowing him to time his attacks to coincide with moments when the defender's faith was strongest. On their most holy days, when they gathered for prayer and comfort, they would find blasphemous symbols carved into their chapel walls, or discover the mutilated bodies of their priests arranged in mockery of their most sacred ceremonies. The systematic destruction of the defender's faith was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the warrior's campaign. He understood that breaking a man's connection to his God was more effective than breaking his body. A wounded soldier could still fight, but a man who had lost his faith would lose the will to resist. The psychological pressure built day by day, week by week, until the very foundations of the defender's identity began to crumble. The warrior's personal involvement in these psychological attacks made them even more terrifying. He would appear on the walls of the city at night, a massive silhouette against the stars that seemed to watch the defender's every movement. His presence was unmistakable even at a distance, and those who caught sight of him would find themselves paralyzed with fear, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at them to hide. Some claimed they could feel his eyes upon them, Even when he was nowhere to be seen, a sensation that followed them into their dreams and haunted their waking hours. The sounds that echoed through the city at night were perhaps the most effective weapon in the warrior's arsenal. These weren't random noises designed to keep people awake. They were carefully orchestrated psychological assaults that exploited the deepest fears of the human mind. The sound of children crying would drift through the streets, but when guards investigated, they would find nothing but empty buildings and shadows. Laughter would echo from the sewers, high and mad and utterly without mercy. Most terrifying of all were the voices that seemed to whisper the names of the defenders, calling to them from the darkness with promises of relief from their suffering. The warrior had learned these techniques from shamans and wise women during his travels, dark knowledge that transformed ordinary siege warfare into something approaching supernatural horror. He understood that the human mind was more vulnerable than the human body, that fears and phobias could be weaponized more effectively than any sword or axe. The systematic assault on the defender's sanity was as precise and calculated as any military campaign designed to break their will to resist long before their bodies faced actual combat. As the siege entered its third month, the effects of the warrior's psychological warfare became impossible to ignore. The city's defenders were no longer functioning as a cohesive military unit. Sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and constant fear had reduced them to a collection of paranoid individuals who trusted no one and sought enemies in every shadow. Guard posts were abandoned as sentries fled their duties rather than face another night of supernatural terror. Officers found their orders ignored by men who had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The breakdown of military discipline was exactly what the warrior had been waiting for. His spies within the city refugees who had been planted among the genuine, displaced persons began reporting that the time was right for the final phase of his campaign. The defenders were no longer capable of mounting an effective resistance. Their morale had been shattered, their faith destroyed, and their ability to fight as a unified force completely compromised. But the warrior's final assault on Uldrichburg wouldn't be a conventional attack. He had spent months preparing for something far more spectacular and terrifying. The city's greatest strength, its massive walls and strategic position, would become the stage for a demonstration of power that would be remembered for generations. The warrior intended to take the city not through overwhelming force, but through a single act of such stunning violence that all resistance would crumble instantly. The plan he had developed was so audacious that even his own men initially thought it was impossible. The walls of Uldrichburg were 30 feet high and 10 feet thick, built from massive stone blocks that had been quarried from the living rock of nearby mountains. They had never been breached in the city's 300-year history, and conventional wisdom said they never could be. But the warrior had identified a weakness that no previous attacker had ever considered. The city's water supply came from a series of underground springs that fed into a complex network of cisterns and channels beneath the streets. These waterways were protected by iron grates and considered too small for any significant infiltration. But the warrior had studied the ancient plans of the city as construction documents that revealed the exact layout of the underground water system. More importantly, he had discovered that one of the main channels passed directly beneath the foundations of the city's strongest tower. The plan that emerged from this discovery was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The warrior would use the water channels to place a massive quantity of explosive materials directly beneath the tower's foundations. The explosion would not only destroy the tower, but would also breach the city wall in a spectacular display that would shatter the defenders' remaining morale. The psychological impact of seeing their strongest fortification reduced to rubble in a single moment would be more devastating than any conventional assault. The explosives the warrior planned to use were unlike anything employed in medieval warfare. Through his travels and conquests, He had acquired knowledge of alchemical compounds that could produce controlled explosions of tremendous force. These substances were dangerous to handle and required precise timing to deploy effectively, but the warrior had spent years learning their secrets from the most skilled practitioners of the dark arts. The infiltration of the city's water system required skills that went far beyond normal military training. The warrior personally led a small team of his most trusted fighters through the underground channels, moving through spaces so cramped that they had to crawl on their bellies for hours at a time. The journey through the flooded tunnels was a nightmare of claustrophobia and suffocation, made worse by the constant fear of discovery by the city's guards. The physical demands of the infiltration were enormous. The warrior and his men had to carry heavy packs of explosive materials through water-filled passages that barely provided enough space to breathe. The weight of the packs, combined with the need to move silently through the echoing tunnels, required strength and endurance that few men possessed. But the warrior had trained for exactly this kind of challenge, pushing his body to its absolute limits in preparation for moments when ordinary human capabilities wouldn't be sufficient. The placement of the explosives required precision that bordered on the supernatural. The warrior had calculated the exact amount of explosive material needed to achieve maximum destruction without causing so much damage that the blast would be ineffective, too little, and the tower would remain standing. Too much, and the explosion would scatter the debris so widely that the psychological impact would be reduced. The calculations involved understanding the structural engineering of medieval fortifications, the physics of controlled explosions, and the psychology of mass terror. The timing of the detonation was equally critical. The warrior had planned the explosion to coincide with the city's morning prayers, when the maximum number of defenders would be gathered in the central square. The sight of their strongest tower collapsing during their most sacred ritual would create a psychological shock that would paralyze the entire population. The message would be unmistakable. Their god had abandoned them. Their defenses were useless, and their only choice was surrender or annihilation. The night before the planned explosion, the warrior made his final preparations with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire career. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, every possible outcome calculated. His men were positioned at key points around the city, ready to exploit the chaos that would follow the explosion. The refugee spies within the walls had been activated, prepared to spread panic and confusion among the defenders. Most importantly, the warrior himself had positioned himself where he could observe the results of his work and make any necessary adjustments to his plan. The explosion that shattered the dawn quiet of Uldrichburg was unlike anything witnessed in medieval warfare. The massive tower, which had stood for 3 centuries as a symbol of the city's strength and permanence, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a solid mass of stone and mortar reaching toward the sky. The next it was gone, replaced by a cloud of dust and debris that rose like a pillar of smoke toward the heavens. The sound of the explosion was heard for miles in every direction, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Windows shattered throughout the city, their glass fragments raining down like deadly snow on the streets below. The ground trembled as if in the grip of an earthquake, causing buildings to sway and crack, and people to fall to their knees in terror and confusion. But it was the sight of the destruction that truly broke the defenders' spirits. The tower had been more than just a military fortification. It had been a symbol of their city's invincibility, a reminder that they were protected by walls that had never been breached. Its destruction in a single catastrophic moment shattered not just stone and mortar, but the fundamental beliefs that had sustained their resistance. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Defenders who had stood firm through months of siege warfare simply laid down their weapons and fled. Officers who had maintained discipline through the darkest hours of the campaign found themselves unable to maintain control over men who had lost all faith in their ability to defend the city. The sight of that massive tower reduced to rubble in an instant had demonstrated that no defense was strong enough to withstand this terrible enemy. The warriors' timing had been perfect. The explosion occurred just as the morning prayers were beginning, when the city's population was gathered in the central square. The site of their strongest fortification, collapsing during their most sacred ritual, created exactly the psychological shock he had intended. Many of the defenders fell to their knees, convinced that their god had abandoned them to this supernatural enemy. Others simply ran, their minds unable to process the reality of what they had witnessed. The breach in the city wall created by the explosion was enormous, a gap nearly 100 feet wide that exposed the city's interior to direct assault. But the warrior had no intention of sending his men through that breach. The explosion had already achieved its primary purpose, the complete destruction of the defenders' will to resist. Any conventional assault would be unnecessary and would reduce the psychological impact of his victory. Instead, the warrior appeared at the breach alone, walking calmly through the rubble and dust as if he were taking a casual stroll through a garden. His massive figure was clearly visible to every defender remaining on the walls, and the sight of him moving with such confidence through the devastation he had created was more terrifying than any army could have been. This wasn't just a military commander. This was a force of nature that could reshape the very landscape to suit his purposes. The warrior's voice carried clearly across the shocked silence of the city as he called out his final ultimatum. The terms were simple: immediate and unconditional surrender, or the complete destruction of everything within the city walls. He had demonstrated his ability to destroy their strongest defenses with a single blow. If they continued to resist, he would use the same methods to reduce the entire city to rubble, leaving no survivors to carry word of what had happened. The debate that followed was brief and one-sided. King Aldrich, watching from his palace tower, could see that his remaining forces were no longer capable of resistance. The explosion had shattered more than just stone and mortar. It had destroyed the fundamental belief that the city could be defended. His officers were reporting mass desertions, his walls were unmanned, and his people were in a state of panic that bordered on madness. The surrender that followed was as complete as any in military history. The gates of Uldrichburg swung open, and the city's entire population filed out to submit to the warriors' mercy. King Uldrich himself, dressed in simple clothes and carrying no weapons, walked to the breach in his city's wall and knelt before the enemy who had destroyed his kingdom. The sight of a king kneeling in the rubble of his own fortifications was a powerful symbol of the warrior's complete victory. But the warrior's mercy proved to be as calculated as his violence. He had no intention of destroying the city or massacring its population. These people would serve a far more valuable purpose alive than dead. They would carry word of his victory to every corner of the known world, spreading stories of his power and ruthlessness that would make future conquests easier. The psychological impact of his victory at Uldrichburg would be felt for generations. As the story of the city's fall became legend, the systematic nature of the warrior's campaign became clear as he consolidated his conquest. This hadn't been a random act of violence or a simple raid for plunder. It had been a carefully planned operation designed to establish his reputation as the most formidable military commander of his age. Every action, from the initial psychological warfare to the final spectacular explosion, had been calculated to achieve maximum impact on both immediate enemies and future opponents. The treasure taken from Uldrichburg was enormous, but the warrior's real prize was the enhancement of his legend. Word of the city's fall spread across the known world like wildfire, carried by refugees, traders, and survivors who had witnessed the impossible. The story grew with each telling, but the essential details remained constant: a warrior of supernatural power, had destroyed an impregnable city through methods that defied conventional understanding of warfare. The conquest of Uldrikburg marked the beginning of a new phase in the warrior's career. He was no longer just another Viking raider or even a particularly successful military commander. He had become something unique in the history of warfare, a figure whose reputation alone could win battles before they were fought. The psychological impact of his victories had created a weapon more powerful than any sword or axe. Other kingdoms throughout the region began to take notice of this new threat. Alliances were formed, armies were raised, and defensive preparations were made on a scale not seen since the great migrations of previous centuries. But these conventional responses to a conventional threat were inadequate to deal with an enemy who had transcended the normal limitations of medieval warfare. The warrior's next targets would be chosen not for their wealth or strategic importance, but for their symbolic value. He understood that reputation was a form of currency that could be accumulated and spent like gold or silver. Each victory would enhance his legend, making future conquests easier and more profitable. The systematic destruction of enemy morale had become his signature tactic, more effective than any siege engine or cavalry charge. The techniques he had developed during the siege of Uldrikburg would be refined and perfected in subsequent campaigns. The use of explosives, the systematic psychological warfare, the corruption of supply lines, and the infiltration of enemy strongholds would become standard elements of his military strategy. But each campaign would also introduce new innovations, new methods of creating terror and despair that would keep his enemies off balance and unable to develop effective countermeasures. The warrior's personal transformation during this period was as remarkable as his military achievements. The constant exposure to violence and death, the systematic cultivation of fear and hatred, and the complete suppression of normal human emotions had changed him into something that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary humanity. His followers began to speak of him in terms usually reserved for gods or demons, and even his enemies acknowledged that he had become something more than mortal. The physical changes were as dramatic as the psychological ones. Years of constant warfare had sculpted his body into an instrument of destruction, every muscle and bone hardened by endless training and combat. His reflexes had become supernatural in their speed and precision. His strength had grown to levels that seemed to defy natural law, and his endurance had reached the point where he could fight for days without rest or food. But it was the mental changes that truly set him apart from other warriors. The constant planning and calculation required for his complex campaigns had developed his intellect to extraordinary levels. He could analyze an enemy's weaknesses with the precision of a master strategist, predict their responses with uncanny accuracy, and devise countermeasures that would neutralize their advantages before they could be employed. The warrior's understanding of human psychology had become his greatest weapon. He could read the fears and desires of his enemies as easily as other men read books, and he could manipulate those emotions to achieve his objectives without ever drawing a sword. The systematic destruction of enemy morale had become an art form in his hands, more precise and effective than any conventional military tactic. As news of Uldrikburg's fall spread throughout the known world, the warrior found himself facing a new kind of challenge. His reputation had grown to such proportions that potential enemies were no longer willing to face him in conventional warfare. Instead, they began to employ desperate measures, assassins, poisoners, and practitioners of dark magic, who hoped to eliminate him through methods that avoided direct confrontation. These attempts on his life only enhanced his legend further. The warrior seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to detect and avoid danger, surviving attacks that should have killed him, and turning the tables on his would-be assassins with ruthless efficiency. Each failed attempt on his life became another story that added to his growing mythology. reinforcing the belief that he was protected by forces beyond mortal understanding. The warrior's response to these assassination attempts was characteristically calculated and brutal. Rather than simply killing his attackers, he would capture them and extract information about who had sent them. Then he would use that information to launch retaliatory campaigns that would make his original enemies regret their decision to oppose him. The message was clear: any attack on him would result in consequences far more severe than the original provocation. The psychological impact of these retaliatory campaigns was enormous. Potential enemies began to realize that hiring assassins or employing indirect methods of attack would only make their eventual fate worse. The warrior had demonstrated that he could track down anyone who opposed him, no matter how carefully they tried to hide their involvement. The fear of retribution became as effective a weapon as any sword or axe in his arsenal. The warrior's growing legend began to attract followers from across the known world. These weren't just ordinary soldiers seeking employment or adventure. They were individuals who had been drawn to his cause by the sheer magnitude of his reputation. Some came seeking glory, others were motivated by greed, and still others were attracted by the opportunity to serve under a commander whose victories seemed to defy natural law. The process of selecting and training these new followers was as rigorous as any military academy. The warrior understood that his reputation depended not just on his personal achievements, but on the quality of the men who fought under his banner. Each potential recruit was subjected to tests that pushed them beyond their physical and mental limits, weeding out those who lacked the dedication and ruthlessness necessary to serve in his army. The training programs he developed were unlike anything employed by conventional military forces. New recruits were taught not just how to fight, but how to think like their commander. They learned to analyze enemies for psychological weaknesses, to plan attacks that would maximize terror and confusion, and to execute complex operations that required perfect coordination and timing. Most importantly, they learned to suppress their normal human emotions and embrace the cold calculation that had made their leaders so effective. The Warrior S Army was becoming something unique in the history of warfare, force that combined the individual ferocity of Viking berserkers with the tactical sophistication of a professional military organization. Each member was a formidable fighter in his own right, but they were also part of a larger machine that could execute operations of staggering complexity and precision. The combination of personal skill and organizational efficiency made them nearly unstoppable in conventional warfare. But the warrior's greatest achievement was the creation of a military culture that could function independently of his personal presence. His officers had learned to think like him, to anticipate his strategies, and to execute his methods even when he wasn't directly supervising their actions. This meant that his influence could be felt across multiple theaters of operations simultaneously, multiplying his effective power far beyond what any single individual could normally achieve. The systematic nature of his approach to warfare was becoming apparent to military observers throughout the known world. This wasn't just a collection of successful battles or a string of lucky victories. It was a comprehensive transformation of the very nature of military conflict, introducing methods and techniques that would influence warfare for generations to come. The warrior had become more than just a successful commander. He had become a revolutionary force that was changing the fundamental rules of military engagement. The impact of his innovations extended far beyond the immediate theater of his operations. Other military commanders began to study his methods, attempting to understand and replicate his techniques. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful because they failed to grasp the complete integration of psychological warfare, tactical innovation, and personal leadership that made his approach so effective. The warrior's methods couldn't be copied piecemeal. They had to be understood as a complete system that required total commitment and transformation. The warrior's influence on military thinking was becoming as significant as his battlefield victories. Military academies throughout the known world began to teach courses based on his campaigns, analyzing his strategies and attempting to understand the principles that made them so effective. But these academic studies often miss the most important element of his success: the complete psychological transformation that had made him capable of employing such ruthless and effective methods. The creation of his military system had required the warrior to transcend normal human limitations and embrace a form of existence that was fundamentally different from ordinary life. The constant exposure to violence, the systematic suppression of normal emotions, and the complete dedication to warfare had changed him into something that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional humanity. This transformation was the foundation of his success, but it was also something that couldn't be taught or replicated through normal training methods. As the warrior's reputation continued to grow, he began to face challenges that went beyond simple military opposition. His success had made him a target for forces that operated outside the normal boundaries of warfare, religious organizations that saw him as a threat to their authority, political alliances that sought to contain his growing power, and even supernatural entities that were drawn to the violence and chaos that surrounded his campaigns. These new challenges required the warrior to adapt his methods once again, developing techniques that could deal with enemies who operated according to different rules than conventional military forces. The skills he had developed in psychological warfare proved invaluable in these conflicts, allowing him to understand and manipulate the motivations of enemies who couldn't be defeated through normal combat methods. The warrior's ability to adapt to new challenges and develop innovative solutions had become one of his most important characteristics. Each enemy he faced taught him something new about the nature of conflict and the methods that could be used to achieve victory. This constant learning and evolution kept him ahead of his opponents, who often found themselves facing tactics and strategies that they had never encountered before. The systematic nature of his approach to learning and adaptation was as impressive as his military achievements. The warrior maintained detailed records of every campaign, analyzing successes and failures to identify patterns and principles that could be applied to future operations. This intellectual approach to warfare, combined with his physical prowess and psychological insight, made him a uniquely formidable opponent who could operate effectively in any environment or against any enemy. The warrior's transformation from a simple Viking raider to a military genius of unprecedented capability represented one of the most remarkable personal evolutions in the history of warfare. The journey had required him to push beyond every normal human limitation, to embrace methods and techniques that most people would find abhorrent, and to develop a form of existence that was fundamentally different from ordinary life, but the results spoke for themselves. He had become the most feared and effective military commander of his age, a figure whose reputation alone could change the course of history. The warrior's evolution into this supernatural force of destruction hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of a transformation so complete and terrifying that it defied everything people thought they knew about human nature. To understand the true horror of what he had become, you need to know about the ritual that changed him from a mortal man into something that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death. The ritual was ancient, older than the gods themselves, passed down through generations of shamans and wise women who understood the darkest secrets of the human soul. It was called the Blood Awakening, and it required a sacrifice so profound that most men would die rather than attempt it. The warrior had learned of this ritual during his travels to the far northern reaches of Scandinavia, where the ice never melted and the sun disappeared for months at a time. The process began with a period of preparation that lasted an entire year. The warrior had to purge himself of every human emotion, every trace of mercy or compassion that might interfere with the transformation. He stopped eating cooked food, consuming only raw meat and blood. He slept on beds of ice and stone, training his body to ignore pain and discomfort. Most importantly, he began to kill, not just in battle, but as a daily ritual, offering the lives of his enemies to the ancient powers that would soon claim his soul. The actual ritual took place during the darkest night of the year, when the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was at its thinnest. The warrior stood naked in a circle of standing stones, his body covered in ritual scars that had been carved with blades forged from meteoric iron. Around him, 13 of his most trusted followers chanted in the old tongue, their voices weaving patterns of sound that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. The centerpiece of the ritual was a sacrifice that would have driven ordinary men insane with horror. The warrior had to kill someone he loved, someone whose death would cause him genuine pain and grief. He had chosen his own brother, a man who had followed him through countless battles and shared his victories and defeats. The killing had to be done slowly, with specific cuts made in a precise pattern that would release the victim's life force in a way that could be absorbed by the ritual as recipient. As his brother's blood soaked into the ancient stones, the warrior felt something fundamental change within him. The part of his soul that had been capable of love, mercy, and compassion was torn away, leaving behind only the cold, calculating intelligence that would make him unstoppable in battle. The transformation was agonizing, as if his very essence was being rewritten by forces that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. The physical changes that followed were equally dramatic. His muscles grew denser and stronger. His bones became harder than steel, and his reflexes accelerated to superhuman levels. His senses sharpened until he could hear a whisper from a mile away, see in complete darkness, and smell fear on his enemies like a hunting animal. Most importantly, his tolerance for pain disappeared entirely, allowing him to fight through wounds that would cripple normal men. But it was the mental changes that truly set him apart from ordinary humanity. The ritual had given him the ability to see into the hearts and minds of his enemies, to understand their deepest fears and desires with perfect clarity. He could predict their actions before they knew what they were going to do themselves. And he could manipulate their emotions like a master musician playing an instrument. The psychological warfare techniques that had made him so effective weren't just learned skills. They were supernatural abilities that had been purchased with his own humanity. The cost of this transformation was enormous. The warrior had gained incredible power, but he had lost everything that made life worth living. He could no longer feel joy, love, or satisfaction. Victory brought him no pleasure, and defeat was simply another problem to be solved. He existed in a state of perpetual emptiness, driven only by the need to inflict pain and death on others. The ritual had made him into the perfect weapon, but it had also made him into something that was no longer truly alive. The first test of his new abilities came during a raid on a fortified monastery that had been built on a rocky island off the coast of Ireland. The monks had hired mercenaries to defend their treasure, and the monastery's location made it virtually impossible to attack by conventional means. The narrow causeway that connected the island to the mainland could be held by a handful of men against an entire army. And the monastery's walls were built from massive stone blocks that had been fitted together with incredible precision. But the warrior no longer thought like a normal military commander. His enhanced senses allowed him to detect weaknesses in the monastery's defenses that would have been invisible to ordinary eyes. He could smell the fear of the defenders, hear the uncertainty in their voices, and see the micro-expressions that revealed their true thoughts and intentions. Most importantly, he could sense the spiritual energy that surrounded the monastery, the faith and devotion of the monks that should have protected them, but would instead become their greatest vulnerability. The attack began not with weapons or siege engines, but with a form of spiritual warfare that turned the monastery's own faith against its defenders. The warrior had learned techniques during his travels that allowed him to corrupt and twist religious energy, transforming prayers into curses and turning sacred symbols into instruments of terror. He began by infiltrating the monastery's chapel during the midnight prayers, moving through the shadows like a ghost despite his massive size. The corruption he introduced was subtle at first. Holy water would begin to smell like blood. Sacred texts would develop stains that looked like screaming faces. Most disturbing of all, the crucifix above the altar would begin to weep tears of black liquid that burned like acid when it touched human skin. The monks tried to cleanse these signs of corruption through prayer and ritual, but their efforts only made the situation worse. The warrior had woven his curse so deeply into the fabric of their faith that every attempt to purify it only strengthened the darkness. The psychological impact on the monastery's defenders was devastating. The mercenaries had been hired to fight human enemies, not to deal with supernatural corruption that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building. They began to desert their posts, fleeing across the causeway in the middle of the night, rather than face another dawn in a place that seemed to be cursed by the devil himself. The monks, meanwhile, were paralyzed by the theological implications of what was happening. How could evil penetrate their sacred sanctuary? Had their god abandoned them to this terrible fate? The warrior's physical assault on the monastery came only after the spiritual defenses had been completely shattered. He appeared at the main gate like a figure from nightmare, his massive form silhouetted against the storm clouds that had gathered overhead. The sight of him was enough to break the remaining defenders' will to resist. This wasn't just a Viking raider seeking treasure. This was something that had crawled out the deepest pit of hell to claim their souls. The battle that followed was less a fight than a massacre. The warrior moved through the monastery's corridors like a force of nature, his enchanted weapons cutting through armor and stone with equal ease. But it wasn't just his physical prowess that made him so terrifying. It was the way he seemed to anticipate every move his enemies made, countering their attacks before they were even launched. The mercenaries found themselves fighting not just a superior warrior, but someone who seemed to know their thoughts and intentions better than they knew them themselves. The monks who witnessed the warrior's rampage through their sacred home described scenes that defied rational explanation. He moved with impossible speed, seeming to be in multiple places at once. His weapons struck with supernatural force, shattering stone walls and cutting through steel armor like paper. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to feed on the violence he created, growing stronger and more terrible with each life he claimed. The treasure taken from the monastery was vast, but the warrior's real prize was the enhancement of his already fearsome reputation. The few survivors who escaped the island carried stories that would be told and retold throughout the Christian world, each version more terrifying than the last. The warrior had demonstrated that no sanctuary was safe from his reach, that no amount of faith or prayer could protect his enemies from his supernatural wrath. But the monastery raid was just the beginning of a campaign that would establish the warrior as the most feared figure in the known world. His next target was a fortress that had been built by the legendary King Charlemagne himself, a structure that represented the pinnacle of medieval military engineering. The fortress of Ironhold was considered absolutely impregnable, its walls rising from the living rock of a mountain peak, its garrison composed of knights who had sworn sacred oaths to defend it to the death. The warrior's approach to this seemingly impossible challenge revealed the full extent of his transformation. He didn't see an impregnable fortress. He saw a complex puzzle that could be solved through the application of supernatural insight and inhuman patience. The siege that followed would last for 6 months, but every day of that siege would bring new horrors that would test the defenders' sanity as much as their courage. The warrior began by establishing a network of terror that extended far beyond the fortress walls. His followers, now numbering in the hundreds, were deployed throughout the surrounding countryside with specific instructions to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread. Villages would wake to find their livestock arranged in ritual patterns, their wells contaminated with substances that cause visions and madness, their children missing with only pools of blood left behind to mark their disappearance. The psychological pressure on the fortress's defenders was enormous. They could see the smoke rising from burning settlements, could hear the distant screams of people being tortured, could smell the stench of death that grew stronger with each passing day. But it was the sounds that drifted up from the darkness below that truly broke their spirits. Every night the mountain would echo with noises that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. The warrior had discovered that the mountain on which the fortress was built was honeycombed with natural caves and tunnels. These underground passages provided perfect acoustics for the psychological warfare he had planned. His followers would position themselves in the caves and create sounds designed to drive the defenders mad with fear, the howling of wolves mixed with human screams, the sound of children crying for help that would never come, and most terrifying of all, the warrior's own laughter echoing through the stone passages like the voice of death itself. The fortress's water supply became another weapon in the warrior's arsenal. The mountain springs that fed the fortress were contaminated with substances that caused hallucinations and paranoia. The defenders began to see enemies in shadows, to hear voices that weren't there, and to turn on each other in fits of madness. The warrior had learned these techniques from practitioners of the dark arts knowledge that allowed him to wage war on the very minds of his enemies. The siege engines that the warrior employed were unlike anything seen in conventional warfare. Rather than simple catapults or battering rams, he constructed devices that were designed to maximize psychological impact. One machine launched containers filled with the severed heads of captured knights, each head preserved in a state that made it appear to be still screaming. Another device created sounds that mimicked the cries of dying children, broadcast at volumes that could be heard throughout the fortress. The defenders' faith, which should have been their greatest strength, became another vulnerability that the warrior exploited with surgical precision. He timed his most horrific attacks to coincide with their religious observances, turning their moments of greatest devotion into experiences of pure terror. When they gathered for morning prayers, they would find blasphemous symbols carved into their chapel walls. When they celebrated their holy days, they would discover the mutilated bodies of their priests arranged in mockery of their most sacred rituals. The fortress's commander, Sir Roderick the Bold, was a veteran of the Crusades who had faced the finest warriors of the Islamic world without flinching. But the enemy he faced now was unlike anything in his experience. This wasn't just a military opponent. This was something that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of warfare and human decency. The psychological pressure of commanding men who were slowly being driven insane by supernatural terror was more challenging than any battle he had ever fought. The warrior's personal appearances during the siege were calculated to maximize their psychological impact. He would appear on the mountainside at dawn, his massive silhouette clearly visible against the rising sun. His presence was unmistakable even at a distance, and the sight of him would cause defenders to freeze in terror, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at them to hide. Some claimed that looking directly at him caused physical pain, as if his very presence was an assault on their souls. The weapons and armor the warrior displayed during these appearances were designed to enhance his supernatural reputation. His axe seemed to drink in light, its blade appearing to be made from crystallized darkness. His armor was decorated with symbols that hurt to look at, directly runes that seemed to writhe and shift when observed. Most disturbing of all was his helmet, fashioned from the skull of some great beast, and decorated with the preserved faces of his most notable victims. The fortress's defenses, which had been designed to withstand conventional siege warfare, proved inadequate against the warriors' supernatural methods. Stone walls that should have been impregnable developed cracks that spread like spider webs, weakening the structure until entire sections began to collapse without warning. Iron gates that had been forged by master smiths began to rust and corrode, as if the very metal was being consumed by some invisible force. The warrior's knowledge of engineering and architecture, enhanced by his supernatural insights, allowed him to identify weaknesses in the fortress's construction that would have been invisible to normal eyes. He could see the stress patterns in the stone, could predict where the structure would fail under pressure, and could time his attacks to exploit these vulnerabilities with perfect precision. The fortress that had stood for centuries began to crumble like a house of cards under his methodical assault. The breakdown of the fortress's defenses was matched by the psychological collapse of its defenders. Months of constant terror had reduced the elite knights to gibbering madmen who jumped at shadows and saw enemies in every corner. The discipline that had made them effective warriors had been replaced by paranoia and fear that made coordinated defense impossible. Sir Roderick found himself commanding men who were no longer capable of rational thought or effective action. The warrior's final assault on the fortress was as spectacular as it was devastating. Rather than a conventional attack, he orchestrated a supernatural event that would be remembered for generations. On the night of the winter solstice, when the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was at its thinnest, he performed a ritual that summoned forces from beyond the grave to aid in his conquest. The ritual required sacrifices of a specific nature, 13 knights who had been captured during the siege, each one representing a different aspect of the fortress's defenses. The sacrifices were performed in a precise pattern around the base of the mountain, with each death releasing spiritual energy that could be channeled into the warrior's assault. The screams of the dying knights echoed through the mountain caves, amplified by the natural acoustics until they seemed to come from the very stones themselves. The supernatural forces that answered the warrior's call were unlike anything witnessed in the mortal world. Shadows began to move independently of their sources, reaching across the fortress walls to strangle defenders in their sleep. The air itself became thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe and causing some men to collapse from suffocation. Most terrifying of all, the voices of the dead began to speak, calling out the names of the living defenders and promising them eternal torment if they continued to resist. The fortress's final collapse was as much spiritual as physical. The walls that had stood for centuries simply crumbled, not from any external force, but as if the very stones had lost the will to remain standing. The defenders who survived the supernatural assault found themselves in a ruin that no longer resembled the mighty fortress they had sworn to defend. Their sacred oaths had become meaningless in the face of forces that operated outside the normal boundaries of honor and duty. Sir Roderick's surrender came not through defeat in battle, but through the complete breakdown of everything he had believed in. The warrior appeared in the ruins of the fortress's great hall, walking calmly through the rubble as if he were inspecting property he had just purchased. His presence was so overwhelming that the surviving defenders simply laid down their weapons and knelt in submission, unable to maintain any pretense of resistance. The terms of surrender that the warrior offered were as terrifying as the siege itself. The surviving defenders would be allowed to live, but they would serve as his messengers, carrying word of his victory to every corner of the known world. They would tell the story of how the mighty fortress of Ironhold had fallen to forces beyond mortal comprehension, how the finest knights in Christendom had been reduced to cowering children by an enemy who commanded powers that defied natural law. The psychological impact of Ironhold's fall was felt throughout the Christian world. The fortress had been considered the ultimate symbol of divine protection, a place where faith and military prowess had combined to create an impregnable defense. Its destruction by supernatural means challenged the fundamental beliefs that held Christian society together. If such a place could fall to the forces of darkness, what hope did ordinary people have of protecting themselves from this terrible enemy? The warrior's reputation had now grown beyond simple military achievement to something approaching mythological status. He was no longer just a skilled commander or even a supernatural warrior. He had become a force of nature that could reshape the very fabric of reality to suit his purposes. The stories told about him had taken on the characteristics of religious texts, describing miracles of destruction that seemed to transcend the normal laws of physics and human understanding. The transformation of his followers during this period was equally remarkable. The men who served under his banner had been changed by their exposure to his supernatural methods, becoming something more than human soldiers, but less than the inhuman perfection their leader had achieved. They moved with unnatural coordination, fought with supernatural skill, and displayed a complete absence of fear or mercy that made them nearly as terrifying as their master. The warrior's army had become a force unlike anything seen in human history. Each member was a formidable fighter in his own right, but they were also part of a larger organism that could execute operations of staggering complexity and precision. The combination of supernatural ability and perfect discipline made them nearly unstoppable in conventional warfare. But it was their reputation for inhuman cruelty that truly made them effective. The impact of the warrior's campaigns extended far beyond the immediate theater of his operations. Other military commanders throughout the known world began to study his methods, attempting to understand and replicate his techniques. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful because they failed to grasp the supernatural transformation that was the foundation of his power. The warrior's methods couldn't be learned through normal training. They required a complete abandonment of humanity that few people were capable of achieving. The warrior's influence on military thinking was becoming as significant as his battlefield victories. Militaries and war colleges began to teach courses based on his campaigns, analyzing his strategies and attempting to understand the principles that made them so effective. But these academic studies often missed the most important element of his success: the complete psychological and spiritual transformation that had made him capable of employing such ruthless and effective methods. The creation of countermeasures against the warrior's tactics became a priority for kingdoms throughout the known world. Alliances were formed, new weapons were developed, and defensive strategies were devised specifically to deal with his unique form of warfare. But these conventional responses to an unconventional threat proved inadequate because they were based on the assumption that the warrior was still bound by normal human limitations. The warrior's next campaign would demonstrate just how far he had transcended those limitations. His target was the Holy Roman Empire itself, the most powerful political and military force in the known world. The emperor had assembled an army of unprecedented size and sophistication, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that medieval technology could produce. The coming confrontation would determine whether supernatural power could triumph over conventional military might on the largest possible stage. The preparations for this campaign revealed the full scope of the warrior's strategic thinking. This wouldn't be just another siege or a series of raids. It would be a systematic dismantling of the very concept of Christian civilization, a demonstration that no earthly power could withstand the supernatural forces he commanded. The intelligence network he had constructed over the previous decade was unlike anything that had existed before. His agents weren't just spies gathering military information. They were psychological warfare specialists, trained to identify and exploit the deepest fears and insecurities of entire populations. They had infiltrated every level of imperial society, from the emperor's own court to the lowest peasant villages, creating a web of influence that could be activated at the warrior's command. The first phase of his campaign began not with armies or siege engines, but with a carefully orchestrated assault on the empire's collective psyche. Strange omens began appearing throughout the imperial territories, livestock born with horrific deformities, wells that ran red with what appeared to be blood, and solar eclipses that occurred at times when no eclipse should have been possible. Each of these events was carefully timed and positioned to maximize its psychological impact on the population. The warrior understood that the empire's greatest strength lay not in its military might, but in the unshakable faith of its people. They believed that their god protected them, that their emperor ruled by divine right, and that their civilization represented the ultimate triumph of good over evil. If he could shatter these beliefs, the empire would collapse from within, long before his armies ever reached its borders. The corruption he introduced into the empire's religious institutions was so subtle that it went undetected for months. Holy relics would begin to emit a foul odor that made worshippers nauseous. Sacred texts would develop stains that looked like screaming faces when viewed in candlelight. Most disturbing of all, priests would begin having dreams that filled them with such terror that they would wake up screaming, unable to remember the details but haunted by a sense of impending doom. The warriors' agents had learned to mimic the empire's own religious practices, allowing them to move freely through churches and monasteries without arousing suspicion. They would introduce small amounts of psychoactive substances into communion wine, causing worshippers to experience visions that challenged their faith. They would replace holy water with liquids that caused painful rashes, leading people to believe that their god was punishing them for unknown sins. The psychological impact of these religious corruptions was devastating. The empire's population had been taught that their faith was their greatest protection against the forces of darkness. When that faith began to seem like a source of torment rather than comfort, the foundations of their entire worldview began to crumble. People who had never questioned their beliefs suddenly found themselves doubting everything they had been taught about the nature of good and evil. The warrior's understanding of mass psychology had reached levels that seemed almost supernatural. He could predict how populations would react to specific stimuli, could calculate the precise amount of fear needed to break their will to resist, and could time his psychological attacks to coincide with moments when his enemies were most vulnerable. This wasn't just military strategy. It was a form of dark magic that used human emotions as weapons. The Empire's military commanders began to notice disturbing changes in their troops long before any enemy armies appeared on the horizon. Soldiers who had been brave and disciplined suddenly became jumpy and paranoid, seeing threats in every shadow. Units that had trained together for years began to turn on each other, their cohesion destroyed by suspicions and fears that seemed to come from nowhere. The warrior's psychological warfare was more effective than any conventional weapon in destroying the empire as fighting capability. The emperor himself, Constantine the Great, was not immune to the warrior's influence. His dreams had become filled with visions of defeat and destruction, images so vivid and terrifying that he would wake up drenched in sweat and shaking with fear. His advisors noticed that he had become increasingly erratic, making decisions that seemed to contradict his previous policies and displaying a level of paranoia that bordered on madness. The warrior's agents had managed to infiltrate even the emperor's personal staff, introducing subtle poisons into his food that would cause hallucinations and mood swings. These substances were carefully chosen to create specific psychological effects: increased aggression that would lead to poor strategic decisions, paranoia that would isolate him from his most trusted advisors, and periods of deep depression that would sap his will to fight. The corruption of the empire's leadership was perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the warrior's campaign. Rather than simply killing key figures, he was turning them into instruments of their own destruction. Every poor decision they made, every display of weakness or instability would undermine the morale of their subordinates, and reduce the effectiveness of their resistance. The warrior was using the Empire's own leadership structure as a weapon against itself. The first direct military confrontation came when the warrior, as advance forces, encountered an Imperial army at the Battle of Blackwater Ford. The engagement was small by Imperial standards, involving only about 5,000 troops on each side, but its psychological impact would be felt throughout the Empire. The Imperial forces were commanded by General Marcus Aurelius, a veteran of dozens of successful campaigns, who had never lost a battle in 20 years of service. The warrior chose to lead this battle personally, not because the strategic situation required it, but because he wanted to make a statement about the futility of conventional resistance. His appearance on the battlefield was unlike anything the Imperial soldiers had ever seen. His armor seemed to absorb light, creating a zone of darkness around him that made it difficult to look directly at his position. His weapons gleamed with an unnatural radiance that hurt the eyes of anyone who tried to focus on them. The psychological impact of his presence was immediate and overwhelming. Imperial soldiers who had faced barbarian hordes without flinching suddenly found themselves paralyzed with terror at the sight of the supernatural enemy. Some dropped their weapons and fled before the battle even began. Others stood frozen in place, unable to process what they were seeing. The warrior's reputation had preceded him, but the reality of his presence was more terrifying than any story could convey. The battle itself was less a military engagement than a demonstration of supernatural power. The warrior moved through the Imperial lines like a force of nature, his weapons cutting through armor and flesh with impossible ease. But it wasn't just his physical prowess that made him so devastating. It was the way he seemed to anticipate every move his enemies made, countering their attacks before they were even launched. The Imperial soldiers found themselves fighting not just a superior warrior, but someone who seemed to know their thoughts and intentions better than they knew them themselves. General Marcus Aurelius, despite his experience and courage, found himself completely outmatched by an enemy who operated according to rules he didn't understand. The tactical formations that had served him well in previous battles proved useless against an opponent who could move with supernatural speed and strike from impossible angles. The weapons and armor that had protected his men in countless engagements seemed like toys when faced with the warrior as enchanted weapons. The massacre that followed was so complete and brutal that it sent shockwaves throughout the Empire. Of the 5,000 Imperial soldiers who had entered the battle, fewer than 100 survived, and those only because the warrior had deliberately allowed them to escape. These survivors would carry word of what they had witnessed back to their comrades, spreading stories of supernatural horror that would undermine the morale of every Imperial unit they encountered. The warrior's treatment of the battlefield after the fighting ended was calculated to maximize its psychological impact. Rather than simply leaving the dead where they fell, he arranged the bodies in patterns that spelled out messages in the old runic script. The messages were simple but terrifying, warnings of what awaited anyone who continued to resist his advance. Promises of torments that would make death seem like a mercy, and challenges to the Emperor himself to face him in single combat. The sight of 5,000 elite soldiers arranged in ritual patterns by a single enemy was more demoralizing than any military defeat could have been. It demonstrated not just the warrior's tactical superiority, but his complete contempt for the Empire's military might. The message was clear. This wasn't just another barbarian invasion that could be repelled through conventional means. This was something that existed outside the normal boundaries of warfare, force that could reshape reality itself to suit its purposes. The news of the Battle of Blackwater Ford reached the Imperial capital within days, carried by the traumatized survivors who had been allowed to escape. Their accounts of the warrior's supernatural abilities were initially dismissed as the ravings of men driven mad by defeat. But as more reports arrived from other fronts, all describing similar encounters with an enemy who seemed to possess abilities that defied natural law. The Empire's leadership began to realize that they were facing something unprecedented. The warrior's strategic brilliance became apparent as his campaign progressed. The Battle of Blackwater Ford hadn't been chosen for its tactical importance. It had been selected because of its symbolic value. The ford was a crossing point that had been used by imperial armies for centuries, a place where the Empire's legions had won countless victories against barbarian invaders. By desecrating this sacred ground with such a complete and horrific defeat, the warrior was sending a message that no tradition or historical precedent could protect his enemies from his wrath. The psychological impact of this symbolic victory was amplified by the warrior's next move. Rather than pressing his advantage through immediate military action, he withdrew his forces and disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only the horrific aftermath of the battle. This apparent retreat confused the imperial commanders who had expected him to follow up his victory with a conventional advance. They didn't understand that the warrior's real objective wasn't territory or plunder, but the systematic destruction of their will to resist. The months that followed were filled with reports of supernatural encounters throughout the Empire's frontier regions. The warrior's forces would appear without warning, strike with devastating effectiveness, and then vanish before any coherent response could be organized. These attacks weren't random raids. They were carefully planned operations designed to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing the warrior's own losses. The pattern of these attacks revealed the warrior's deep understanding of imperial psychology and military doctrine. He would target not just military installations, but the symbols and institutions that gave the empire its sense of identity and purpose. Churches would be found desecrated in ways that challenged the fundamental beliefs of Christian civilization. Government buildings would be destroyed with a precision that suggested supernatural knowledge of their construction. Most disturbing of all, the warriors' forces would sometimes appear in places that should have been impossible to reach, suggesting that they possessed abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The Empire's response to these attacks was hampered by the very strengths that had made it successful in previous conflicts. The imperial military was designed to fight conventional enemies using established tactics and strategies. The bureaucratic systems that governed the empire required clear chains of command and standardized procedures. The religious institutions that provided moral guidance were based on beliefs that didn't account for the existence of supernatural enemies who seemed to operate outside divine law. The warrior's campaign was systematically exploiting each of these institutional weaknesses. His forces would strike at targets that were protected by conventional defenses, demonstrating that traditional military thinking was inadequate against supernatural threats. His attacks would be timed to coincide with bureaucratic decision-making processes, creating chaos that prevented effective responses. Most devastatingly, his operations would challenge religious doctrines in ways that left the empire as spiritual leaders unable to provide guidance or comfort to their terrified populations. The psychological pressure on the empire's leadership was becoming unbearable. Emperor Constantine found himself facing a crisis that his training and experience hadn't prepared him for. The military advisors who had guided him through previous conflicts were offering strategies that seemed inadequate against an enemy who didn't follow conventional rules. The religious leaders who had provided moral support were struggling to explain how such evil could exist in a world supposedly governed by divine justice. The warriors' agents within the imperial court were carefully monitoring these developments, feeding information back to their master that allowed him to adjust his strategy for maximum psychological impact. They reported that the emperor was becoming increasingly isolated, trusting fewer and fewer of his advisors as paranoia consumed his ability to make rational decisions. The court was fragmenting into competing factions, each with its own theory about how to deal with a supernatural threat that seemed to be closing in from all sides. The warrior's understanding of political psychology was as sophisticated as his military tactics. He knew that the empire's greatest strength lay not in its armies or its fortifications, but in the unity and confidence of its leadership. If he could shatter that unity, the empire would collapse from within, regardless of its military capabilities. The psychological warfare campaign he had been conducting was designed to create exactly this kind of internal breakdown. The reports reaching the imperial capital were becoming increasingly bizarre and terrifying. Entire villages would be found empty, their populations vanished without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic messages written in what appeared to be blood. Military patrols would discover the bodies of their comrades arranged in ritual patterns that seemed to spell out curses in unknown languages. Most disturbing of all, some survivors of these encounters would return to civilization fundamentally changed, speaking in tongues and displaying knowledge of events that hadn't happened yet. The warriors' forces had grown far beyond a simple military organization. They had become something resembling a religious cult, united not just by loyalty to their leader, but by shared participation in rituals and practices that transformed them into something more than human. The supernatural abilities they displayed weren't just the result of superior training or equipment. They were the product of a collective transformation that had fundamentally altered their nature. The initiation rites that new recruits underwent were designed to break down their normal human limitations and rebuild them according to the warrior's vision. These ceremonies involved ordeals that pushed candidates beyond their physical and mental breaking points, weeding out those who lacked the dedication or capacity to embrace the supernatural transformation. Those who survived emerged as something that existed between human and demon, retaining their intelligence and skills while gaining abilities that defied natural law. The warrior-S army had become a force that operated according to rules that conventional military thinking couldn't comprehend. They moved with perfect coordination despite being scattered across vast distances, as if connected by some form of telepathic communication. They displayed knowledge of enemy movements and plans that seemed to come from supernatural sources rather than conventional intelligence gathering. Most importantly, they fought with a complete absence of fear or self-preservation that made them nearly unstoppable in combat. The Empire's military commanders were beginning to realize that they were facing something that couldn't be defeated through conventional tactics. The warriors' forces didn't behave like normal armies. They didn't have supply lines that could be cut, bases that could be attacked, or morale that could be broken. They seemed to exist in a state of perpetual readiness, able to appear anywhere at any time with devastating effectiveness. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating for the Empire's military leadership. Generals who had built their careers on understanding and exploiting enemy weaknesses found themselves facing an opponent who seemed to have no weaknesses at all. The strategic doctrines that had guided imperial military thinking for centuries were proving inadequate against an enemy who operated according to supernatural principles. The warrior's next major operation demonstrated the full extent of his strategic sophistication. Rather than attacking the Empire's military forces directly, he launched a campaign against its economic infrastructure. Trade routes were disrupted not through conventional raids, but through supernatural phenomena that made travel impossible. Merchant caravans would disappear without a trace, their goods found later arranged in patterns that seemed to mock the Empire's commercial prosperity. The economic warfare campaign was even more effective than the military attacks had been. The Empire's prosperity depended on trade networks that connected distant provinces and allowed for the efficient distribution of goods and resources. When these networks began to fail, the effects were felt throughout the imperial system. Cities that depended on imported food began to experience shortages. Military units that relied on centralized supply systems found themselves unable to maintain their equipment and weapons. The warrior understood that economic disruption could be more devastating than military defeat. A lost battle might damage morale or reduce military capability, but economic collapse would undermine the very foundations of imperial society. The systematic destruction of trade networks would create suffering that affected every level of the population, from the emperor's court to the humblest peasant villages. The supernatural methods used to disrupt trade were carefully chosen to maximize their psychological impact. Merchant caravans wouldn't simply be robbed. They would be found arranged in ritual patterns that suggested the involvement of forces beyond human understanding. Trade goods wouldn't just be stolen. They would be transformed into objects that caused revulsion and fear in anyone who looked at them. The warrior was using economic warfare as another form of psychological assault, demonstrating that no aspect of imperial life was safe from his influence. The empire's response to these economic attacks revealed the limitations of its institutional structure. The bureaucratic systems that govern trade and commerce were designed to deal with conventional threats, like banditry or political instability. They had no procedures for addressing supernatural phenomena that seemed to operate outside natural law. The officials responsible for maintaining trade networks found themselves unable to develop effective countermeasures against threats they couldn't understand or predict. The warriors' campaign was achieving its objectives with terrifying efficiency. The empire's military forces were demoralized and scattered, unable to mount an effective defense against an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. The economic systems that sustained imperial civilization were collapsing under the weight of systematic disruption. Most importantly, the psychological foundations of imperial society were crumbling as people lost faith in their leaders' ability to protect them from this unprecedented threat. The emperor's attempts to rally his people through public appearances and proclamations were backfiring spectacularly. The crowds that gathered to hear him speak were filled with people who had been terrorized by months of supernatural warfare. Their faces showed not loyalty and determination, but fear and desperation. The emperor's words of confidence and defiance rang hollow when delivered to audiences who had witnessed the futility of conventional resistance. The warriors' agents in the capital were carefully monitoring these public events, reporting back on the emperor's declining influence and the growing panic among the population. They noted that the emperor's own guards seemed nervous and distracted, jumping at shadows and displaying the kind of paranoid behavior that indicated their morale was breaking down. The very people who were supposed to protect the empire as leadership were becoming unreliable due to the psychological pressure of the warrior as campaign. The religious institutions that had provided moral guidance and comfort to the empire's population were struggling to maintain their authority in the face of events that challenged their fundamental doctrines. Priests who had preached about the ultimate triumph of good over evil found themselves unable to explain how such supernatural evil could exist in a world supposedly governed by divine justice. The theological frameworks that had sustained Christian civilization for centuries were proving inadequate to address the reality of the warrior's power. The warrior's corruption of religious institutions was perhaps the most insidious aspect of his campaign. Rather than simply destroying churches and killing priests, he was transforming religious practice itself into a source of terror and doubt. Sacred rituals would be interrupted by supernatural phenomena that made worshippers question their faith. Holy relics would begin to emit sounds and odors that suggested demonic rather than divine influence. Most disturbing of all, some priests would begin to preach sermons that subtly undermined Christian doctrine, spreading ideas that seemed to come from the warrior's own twisted philosophy. The psychological impact of religious corruption was devastating for a society that had been built on Christian principles. The empire's laws, customs, and social structures were all based on religious teachings that provided moral guidance and social cohesion. When those teachings began to seem unreliable or even dangerous, the entire fabric of imperial society began to unravel. People who had never questioned their beliefs suddenly found themselves doubting everything they had been taught about the nature of reality. The warrior's understanding of religious psychology was as sophisticated as his military tactics. He knew that faith was more than just intellectual belief. It was an emotional and spiritual foundation that gave people the strength to endure hardship and maintain hope in the face of adversity. By systematically undermining that foundation, he was destroying his enemy's capacity for resistance more effectively than any conventional weapon could have done. The Empire's attempts to counter the warriors' religious warfare were hampered by the very nature of the threat they faced. Church leaders who tried to reassure their congregations about the ultimate triumph of good over evil found their words contradicted by daily evidence of supernatural evil that seemed to be winning. Theological scholars who attempted to explain the warrior's abilities within Christian doctrine found themselves forced to acknowledge possibilities that challenged their most fundamental beliefs. The warrior's campaign was entering its final phase, and the psychological pressure on the Empire was reaching unbearable levels. The population was living in a state of constant terror, never knowing when or where the next supernatural attack would occur. The military forces that were supposed to protect them had proven inadequate against an enemy who seemed to possess abilities that transcended natural law. The religious institutions that should have provided comfort and guidance were themselves struggling with doubts and fears that made them unable to offer effective support. The Emperor's last desperate attempt to rally his empire involved calling for a great crusade against the warrior and his forces. The proclamation was distributed throughout the imperial territories, calling on all loyal citizens to take up arms against the supernatural threat that menaced their civilization. The response was telling. Instead of the massive mobilization that previous calls to arms had produced, the Emperor's proclamation was met with silence and evasion. The people who should have been eager to defend their homeland were too terrified and demoralized to respond. The warrior's psychological warfare had achieved what conventional military campaigns could never have accomplished: the complete destruction of an empire's will to resist. The imperial forces that remained were scattered and demoralized, their commanders unable to develop effective strategies against an enemy who seemed possess supernatural knowledge of their plans and intentions. The civilian population was paralyzed by fear and doubt, no longer believing that their leaders could protect them from the horrors that seemed to be closing in from all sides. The final confrontation between the warrior and the Holy Roman Empire was approaching, and the outcome seemed inevitable. The Empire's military might, its economic resources, and its religious authority had all been systematically undermined by a campaign that had targeted the psychological foundations of imperial civilization. The warrior had demonstrated that conventional power was meaningless against an enemy who understood the deepest fears and weaknesses of human nature. But even as victory seemed within his grasp, the warrior was facing a crisis of his own. The supernatural transformation that had given him his incredible abilities was exacting a price that grew heavier with each passing day. The emptiness that consumed him was becoming harder to ignore, the meaninglessness of his existence more apparent with each triumph. He had gained the power to destroy civilizations, but he had lost the ability to enjoy the fruits of his victories. The emptiness that consumed him was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. Victory brought him no satisfaction. Conquest gave him no joy, and the fear he inspired in others provided no comfort. He existed in a state of perpetual hunger that could never be satisfied, driven by needs that went beyond normal human desires. The warrior had become the most powerful individual in the known world, but he had also become the most profoundly alone. The approaching confrontation with the Holy Roman Empire would test not just his tactical brilliance, and supernatural abilities, but his very reason for existence. What was the point of unlimited power if it brought no happiness? What was the value of absolute victory if it left him more empty than before? These questions would haunt him as he prepared for the greatest campaign of his career, a battle that would determine whether his transformation into something beyond humanity had been worth the terrible price he had paid. The warrior stood at the threshold of ultimate triumph, but he also stood at the edge of an abyss that might swallow not just his enemies, but his own tortured soul. The forces he had unleashed could no longer be controlled, and the path he had chosen could never be reversed. The most terrifying Viking warrior in history was about to face his greatest enemy, the consequences of his own choices, and the true cost of the power he had gained.